Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I'm Jim Henry and here with my good friend and co-host Sal Lafreri. Before we begin, I would like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. Please leave comments on your opinion. It is very important to us. So today's topic is a deeper dive into edge device technology. So Sal, we've had a number of podcasts now and this evolution/revolution moving toward movement to the edge for a lot of the technology for electronic security and whatnot. We did a previous podcast here with Meraki, which was the initial exposure of that platform from Cisco in this direction. And we've had a number of other podcasts that have also been driving toward this technology being at the edge, and then the analytics and whatnot that are also moving to the edge. So I'd say that you could now call this a trend, right?
We can, and I think it's a good one. I think there are so many benefits to it from the technology side, and then from the end user side. I always try and take the end user side of it. The guy who's got to run this thing when it's at a facility. And what I really love about all of this is the simplicity to it. Especially when you're looking at systems like what we're going to talk about today, where it's actually in simple English, where I don't have to worry about constantly training people on how to get it. Because, certain systems that are out there, especially with the analytics, if you're not familiar with how to get to a particular, videotape, show my age. If you're not able to get to a specific point in a video, it becomes problematic, right? 11 o'clock at night, I need a piece of video, and you call up and you say, here's what I want to look at. And the guy, I don't know how to work it. I don't remember how to do it. So what we're seeing with the edge technology, obviously, is that things are, becoming much more simpler, much more, easier for the operators to run. And I really like that. I like the capability that you get from security and all of that. So all in all, I'm a big fan of the edge technology. I'm really looking forward to this.
And again, this is necessity being the mother of invention, kind of being a replay of what we talked about during the first Meraki podcast. The movement from analog to IP 20 years ago initially was, this is great. We can save a lot on all this infrastructure and cabling and, what have you. And it's going to give us more functionality and save a lot of money. And then came the cyber threat vector, and all of a sudden the systems had to become more hardened and more complex and have a lot more oversight and IT management, and the costs expanded. And then, the end users saying, where the hell was the savings? We were supposed to be getting in this movement from analog to IP. And plus we have all these additional risks. And I think that really all has come together now to that, along with the development of technology to enable, eliminating some of this complexity and infrastructure and moving to the edge. So enough of the intro from the two of us. Let's get some really smart people in here. Our two guests today are Ryan Harami. Ryan is currently a Meraki sales specialist focusing on accounts in New York City. He's been with Cisco Meraki for over 8 years and has seen Meraki grow from an $80 million per year company to over $2 billion per year. A strong believer that while networking can spiral into complexity, modern day use cases demand simplicity. CJ Ramsey is a Cisco Meraki consulting engineer serving New York City. CJ has been with Cisco Meraki for 3+ years, first on the product team and now as a client-facing engineering resource. Prior to joining Cisco Meraki, CJ spent the entirety of his career in the IT space working for a Cisco partner in various engineering and sales capacities. So, two of you gents, welcome to the show. Can you give us a quick overview of edge technology for our listeners?
Absolutely, guys, and thanks for having us. So, I think you guys hit the nail on the head there, right? I think there's been an evolution in this space, right? You start from just core networking needs that IT cares about, right? And as a traditional IT company has now expanded into this world of physical security, we now are also learning what the needs of physical security companies are, right? Those components, we come at it from an IT perspective, and from in the IT world, it's simplify everything. It's commoditize things, right? Things that have been traditionally very difficult to deploy and manage in the past, things like Wi-Fi, those are things that are now just expected to work, right? I always give the analogy of if you drive by a motel and you see a sign that it has color TV, that's a little outdated, right? So now when you drive by something and it says, hey, we have Wi-Fi, you kind of are going, yeah, I kind of expected that, right? So as you kind of looked to networking becoming this commodity, right, we're now taking that next step and trying to bring that into the world of physical security. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And I think it's a very exciting topic.
So getting into, you guys are on the technical side of it, and I'm probably the least technical person in the show. So we understand, that you have the edge device, and then somewhere it's going to get, it goes back to a head end system of some sorts. But what about the piping that goes between both of that? How do you handle that? Is that a consideration? Because I can see people saying, hey, it is a great device. I just stick it up on a wall and it's going to mystically, magically come back. Talk to us a little bit about the piping.
Certainly. And from an IT perspective, I'm an engineer, so I can get very excited in going through all of the steps, all of the stages, all of the handshakes, all of the technical nonsense that's happening on the back end. But as an end user, we don't really care about that, right? We want our camera to come online. We want it to work, and we want to know that the transport end to end is going to be secure. And so the focus at Cisco Meraki has been, how do we deliver these enterprise transport technologies, but then wrap it up in an interface that's easy for everybody to understand? Now, Sal, if I asked you to describe to me class of service, differentiated services, code point mappings, what markings are appropriate for what types of traffic, could you explain that back to me?
Oh, sure. We went through this a couple of episodes ago when we had another technical person that was on that started talking, and I said to him, whoa, stop, you're talking Chinese. I got enough trouble working a dimmer switch.
Exactly. So DSCP markings mean nothing to you, essentially. But if I asked you, within your network, you have security cameras, you have Facebook traffic, and you have email traffic. Now, can you order those in terms of what's most important to getting to its destination first? You'd probably say something like, my cameras are top priority so I can stream footage in real time, emails so that we can make sure we're getting alerts. And then if we have bandwidth left, let's let them use a little bit of Facebook. That's the kind of language we should be able to use to define these complex technical mappings on the back end. And that's the logic that we've brought into the interface. So the goal is have a conversation around what you want to accomplish. You don't have to know all the zeros and ones that are making it happen.
It works for me.
So contrast that to how most standard deployments are protected against, hacking and DDoS attacks.
Certainly. And on the back end, from a technology perspective, the same mechanisms are taking place, right? Within technology, you have what's known as the OSI model. Within that, there are these different layers, and that's where you can employ different methods of security protection. And so whether I create a rule to block traffic from one IP address to another, or whether I create that same rule saying camera 1 shouldn't be able to talk to camera 2, the zeros and ones on the back end are behaving the same way. What it comes down to is, what kind of interface do you want to interact with? And from an engineering perspective, we've tried to make it as difficult as possible traditionally so that we can feel super important. We're now trying to make this simpler in terms of making it a commodity anybody can use.
I've been doing this a few decades, more than a few decades. And, I've seen some of the evolutionary changes from tube cameras to chip cameras, from analog to digital and what have you. And it seems like this, for a systems integrator, you're always reinventing yourself. And, the one common denominator is end users with problems. And then you continue to evolve in technology and solve new problems with newer technology and what have you. But there's a continuous cycle of solutions. And in many cases, it eliminates roles and tasks that the integrator used to perform. When I got out of college, we had technicians running out, changing limit switches and pan and tilts and tubes and cameras. I don't do too much of that today. And, the integrators have evolved, manufacturers have evolved. And there was a big pushback, when physical security moved into the IT space. And there was a lot of friction between, the security departments and the IT departments. now that IT departments have a stronghold on most security systems, because that is the transport, now we come along with this solution that largely saves expense on the IT side. And are we going to see a pushback here from the IT departments? Not because this is not a good and viable technology and a safe way of being able to increase functionality and reduce risk, but it impacts a lot of careers on the IT side, to be blunt.
One of the things I would ask us to think about here is what is effect on unplanned work within your day-to-day tasks, right? You have certain job functions you do on maybe a daily basis, a weekly basis, and then you have those large initiatives and projects that you're working on. However, within that, you also have unplanned work. These are things like troubleshooting why a camera went offline, trying to map an IP address back to a specific location, all of these things that pop up in the day. Now, the issue becomes unplanned work is the most destructive type of work because you're not only taking away from planned projects, but you're also adding in another task that needs to be dealt with. And so our goal is not to replace people, not to say you had 10 people before, you can do this with 5. Our goal is to cut down on that unplanned work so that free up these talented individuals to focus on business level initiatives as opposed to day-to-day routine minutia.
That's a great way to frame it. I appreciate that.
If I could add something in there as well, guys. So you mentioned this idea that IT is now in essence a gatekeeper, right, to some of this technology, right? And when I have conversations with IT buyers, some of the things that I mention is like, hey, in the world of IT, there used to be like networking guys, like route switch people, and then there used to be like phone guys, right? And these are guys that like had this experience with telephony and whatnot, right? That's gone, right? There's no longer a phone guy. Phones fall to IT, right? And so in the physical security space, we see a couple different flavors, right? You have organizations that there's such an importance on physical security that they still have a dedicated team to that, right? You need not only a dedicated team that understands different threats to a business, right? And needs to have specially trained people to deal with that, but also they say, hey, you go make your own technology decisions that solve your problems. And if IT can become an enabler of that, great, let us know. And that's what we see in Meraki. We actually call this the digital workplace, right? So we're seeing this convergence of, hey, yes, you might not have IT making these decisions, but also IT should be enabling you from a technology perspective. So I think really cool part of this edge technology is that we are building into this camera things that IT cares about, right? Easy to upgrade firmware. That you can push a button and it happens overnight. You don't have to spend weeks, months planning for standard upgrades, right? But also there's technology built into these cameras that enable other IT use cases, things like BLE technology, right? So, that's a really great thing about the way Cisco Meraki has approached this is taking everything we know about what IT cares about and trying to marry that together with everything that a physical security team would care about.
All right. Well, that's going to take us to the end of segment 1. We just want to remind everyone that you're listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and me, Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, whether in person or virtually, or would like to consult with either one of us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So segment 2, let's talk about logistics. And again, we'll probably start from the very basic, but explain to us and listeners, what are the logistical issues and the logistical differences between edge technology and traditional system with standard system deployments?
So when it comes to traditional systems, right, if we think how far we want to wind this clock back a little bit here, right, but we've already mentioned a few of these things like analog systems, right? And let's take like from the very beginning, right? Analog systems, you'd have an electrician that comes in and installs a DC power supply system and then runs DC power lines with coax attached to them out to a particular camera that provides the power, coax provides the data, and you're off and running, right? So if you think about the components of that, right? Someone had to come in, tell you where to put cameras. You had to have very different expertise to install electrical systems, et cetera, right? And then on top of that, to actually then go view footage, right? You needed a machine to go view that footage. That machine needed software on it to go access that footage. You need storage for that footage. So those are all different components. Now, if you look at modern systems, right? So we now have IP, the networking, that's a part of this, right? But that's not without its own complexities, okay? So, all right, I can have a switch port to plug into, but how does that switch port get to the internet? How do I manage that switch port? How do I allocate PoE budget? How do I know if that switch goes offline? I don't know anything about VLANs. What's a VLAN? How do I define that on a switch, right? So if you look at these modern systems, the networking introduces its own complexities. And if you are a standalone physical security team, you might be inclined to say, all right, I got a switch at home. At home, I use a Netgear switch. So I'm going to go get that and plug these cameras in. And great, it works. You know where that switch is. You installed it. Everything's great. Now, let's fast forward to there's cybersecurity threats. There's maybe you as the installer, you're no longer with the company. You've moved on to a different role. The new person taking over the system doesn't know that you have a Netgear switch powering cameras in this closet on the third floor, right? And on top of that, if that ever goes offline, you have to troubleshoot it, et cetera. You are, basically at the mercy of the technology. So when we go back to this idea of commoditizing networking, Meraki has been in this field for quite some time. I mentioned earlier, we started with things like Wi-Fi, right? We've made Wi-Fi super, super simple. But everything that we did to Wi-Fi, we also did to the rest of what I would call the networking stack, right? So from your firewall, right, that is protecting you from internet threats to your switching that powers your cameras, et cetera, right? Meraki has taken those technologies and put it into very easy to manage interfaces all through the Meraki dashboard. And the greatest thing about all of this is that when you're using Meraki technology like firewalls and switching, and you're using Meraki technology like cameras, those are all in the same management console. Okay. So if you see a camera's offline, you can immediately go and say, well, it's plugged into this device. Is that device online? And then that one, is it connected to the internet? You have that full visibility end to end. So yes, your job is to monitor cameras. Yes, your job is to make sure that this door is secure. But in going backwards from that, you now have that visibility all the way out to the internet.
Well, that's a great lead in to a follow-up that I have with regards to communications to these edge devices. So especially in a case where you may have a hybrid of edge storage as well as cloud storage, or you're looking for, again, some real-time, surveillance and whatnot, secured communications is key. So what's the flexibility, between a, customer provided broadband Wi-Fi versus dedicated Wi-Fi, or even dedicated private cellular communications network, out to the edge devices?
Certainly. And so with that, I think a lot of people tend to view a dedicated circuit, whether that be, cellular, a wired ISP, whatever the case is, as the most secure option because it's physically isolated. The way I look at it, though, is that now becomes another entry point that you need to be mindful of security. And so when it comes to corporate integrations, oftentimes we find that you are better off in some cases bringing these cameras onto the corporate network because your team has already invested in that corporate security. You've put that big firewall out at the edge. You have comprehensive authentication policies for within the network. And so then the question becomes, how do we integrate our cameras into that greater IT solution? And so from our perspective at Cisco Meraki, we're pretty uniquely poised here because remember, we're a networking company that then got into physical security, not the other way around. So when we built these cameras, we already had network standards in mind around authentication, around encryption, around how devices would communicate with each other. as opposed to when you look at a traditional security manufacturer, they started building cameras when everything was connected via copper directly, right? And so as the networks evolved, they've had to go back and say, how do we figure out these authentication standards? How do we figure out these networking security standards? And they've done their best to try to integrate into those. Our solution was born out of those standards. And so that's the difference, is the approach and the mindset there.
So of all the things it can do, talk to us about some of the potential limitations when you're deploying these systems. What would be some of the limitations? What are the things that would concern you?
First and foremost, from my perspective, this is all based on having a solid network backbone. Without a solid network, you are unable to build anything on top of it. And so what I mean by a solid network, is it redundant and resilient? If I lose, one cable, is that going to bring down half of my building? So understanding from a network backbone perspective, do we have the resiliency and do we have the quality? Because as y'all are well aware, video eats up a lot of bandwidth, right? It is a hungry application. So trying to put a large video deployment on an already constrained network is essentially just asking for disasters. So to me, that would be the number one limitation to be thought of. The second one is, of course, going to be around the actual physical deployment. There are a lot of things we can do from a technology perspective to help make up for poor wireless connections, even poor wired connections. However, there's nothing I can do from a technology standpoint to make up for a poorly placed camera. If you aim your camera at a corner instead of at the doorway, there is nothing I can do in retrospect to reorient that. So I would say that the biggest issues I see people running into are found when we don't put the proper planning in on the front end.
I'll add one thing to that as well, right? So when we talk about like what's mission critical here, right? Mission critical is I need to be able to see that camera. Okay. So do that with a system that is edge based, right? I am going to the internet to get that data. Okay. So I need reliable internet. Okay. If I want to watch video in real time, but this is where the power of edge technology comes in, right? Because let's say, we've all seen the movie where some guy goes in and cuts the internet lines and you're like, okay, the building's dark. They can't dial 911 now or whatever it is, right? Well, in edge technology, right? Remember, the recording is happening on the camera. So while you may not be able to go back and view that footage until you have an internet connection, this is unboxing a whole other thing around cellular technologies as a backup way to get in, et cetera. We won't go into that right now, but just remember, even if your internet goes down, the edge recording is still happening. Okay. So when you come back up, you didn't lose anything. This isn't streaming out to something. This isn't going back to a server in a back closet somewhere. This is being recorded on the camera itself. Right. So I would say just one of those limitations you just got to be very aware of is that, hey, you need to make sure your network backbone is solid, it's redundant, you have good internet connections, etc. I think that's probably in the system like this, in these edge-based systems, it's the most important thing so that you could view the footage live.
So let's talk a little bit about analytics in this architecture. When analytics first came on the scene, initial ones 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago maybe, they were server-based, and then slowly we've seen them move out into the edge. Would you say that now, of course, the level of horsepower and the sophistication of the analytics that can be processed out of the edge, again, is far above and beyond what could have ever been done back then. But does it also give you more personalized application or site-specific sophistication and effectiveness of the analytics at the edge? Because, really each camera's out there, in a different environment, a different scene, and having those analytics specific to that site, whether they're rules-based or they're eventually machine learning, eventually, artificial intelligence, is that going to give is that going to be more like rifle hunting rather than, hunting with a shotgun? So that you can get a much better, return on the expectation of what your analytics are going to give you in that architecture?
Yeah, certainly. So to kind of build off that analogy, I would say this is going to be sniper hunting. The reason I say that is because essentially what we're doing is, yes, we're leveraging processors on the cameras themselves to do that edge processing of data. We're then able to leverage the cloud on the back end to serve as a collector, an aggregator, and ultimately a correlator of this data. And so with this cloud backend, we're able to garner information and data from every individual camera. And then we're able to do things like side-by-side comparisons. We're able to look over a long period of time and say, have we spotted anomalies within this data set? And then we're able to compare multiple data sets against each other because the cloud acts as that ultimate broker, taking the individual data from the edge itself. So from my perspective, it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? Because we have all of these individual collectors, and then we have a central repository where we can get that 30,000 foot view and then begin diving into specific points.
So we're talking about storage, at the edge, and make those that aren't familiar with it. We understand that you have a camera system and you have, 2, 3, 4, 10 terabytes of storage that all of the cameras coming back to. Now you have the storage at the edge, but you don't have the same size as the mass storage unit. Explain the thinking behind that and how all of that works out.
Certainly. So this goes back to that conversation around shifting from a centralized architecture to an edge architecture. And one of the key downsides to a centralized architecture is that because you have these different components, you end up in a constant procurement cycle. And so maybe I replace my cameras every 5 to 6 years, but I have to replace my spinning disk storage every 3 to 4 years. Servers are only good for 2 to 3 years. And so with that, every year I end up buying something different. I'm constantly doing work. And that's, one of the downsides and why we looked away from centralized storage. So with this edge storage, each camera is actually going to have its own hard drive sitting on the device itself, and it's going to record that video footage locally on the camera. The benefit here is twofold, really. First, we don't have these large racks of spinning disk storage that we need to replace every 3 to 4 years. But second, it provides a very specific per unit cost to scale because each camera is going to bring with it everything it needs, right? I don't have to worry that my storage today can support 100 cameras. If I had 101 cameras, I have to buy a bunch of new storage to facilitate that additional unit, right? Each device is going to bring with it its own storage, and therefore you can get a very specific per unit cost to scale. So from the procurement perspective, we see a lot of simplicity there. From a data perspective, the first thing is we never have to worry that there's one single place that we need to corrupt. If everything goes back to centralized storage, as an attacker, as a bad agent, I know that all I have to do is attack that one specific resource, and I'm going to take all of their footage away. Within our scenario, you'd have to physically take every single camera to get every piece of footage from that facility. The second piece is we are able to leverage technologies on the back end to aggregate that footage. So should you want to put it into the cloud, should you want to put it onto servers, that's certainly an option as well.
So that would give you a little bit of a hedge against if you did have a failure of the hard drive at a particular camera that was critical, rather than adding more cameras to have some redundancy there. That hybrid approach would give you that backup to that hardware failure.
Certainly. Yeah. The example I always think about is a total loss scenario where the building burns to the ground and I want to see the spark that started the fire. That would be a great instance for having that cloud offloading of your video footage.
Well, that's a great place to end the logistics section here. Remind everybody you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lavreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So the third segment where we really kind of wrap it up in the solution of what this architecture, brings to us. And we'll start off with ease. This is ease of use, but how about ease of deployment with the Wi-Fi, platform? Give us the elevator pitch for that.
Absolutely. Okay, so if we tie this back into a physical security use case, right? So you're like, hey, I really like these cameras. I want to get them connected to the internet. The easiest way to do that is, of course, Wi-Fi, right? Providing power to cameras is obviously self-explanatory. You have to give power to the camera. But what if we can say, hey, let's just have that camera connect over Wi-Fi so that when you want to view the footage, you can do that. Now, not to keep picking on Sal here, right? But if I went back to Sal and said, hey, what's your 5 gigahertz spectrum look like in that building? What's your channel utilization look like? Do you use 20 megahertz channels? Do you use 40 megahertz channels? Again, he's going to look at me the same way he looked at me earlier, which is, I don't get it, right? I'm not a Wi-Fi guy.
You'd get an answer that wouldn't be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not a lot of Wi-Fi guys in the world. I think, like I said, it's a commodity now. You kind of just assume that Wi-Fi works, right? So giving you the high level pitch of Meraki is, hey, plug our Wi-Fi devices in, and there's a ton of technology inside of these Meraki APs to self-optimize. Okay, so they go through and they say, what's the best channel for me to use? What's the best power level settings for me to use? And then in the dashboard, configuring them, give me a pre-shared key, make that easy for me to deploy and manage. So it is really one of these things that we kind of refer to as zero-touch provisioning. While these units are getting shipped to you, you can have everything ready to go. So you just plug them into the network and they kind of self-optimize.
Yeah. So the comparison I always tell people here is, if you think 15 years ago, when it came to booking a plane ticket, say I want to go from New Jersey to San Francisco, I would have to go to a travel agent typically to book that ticket, because I didn't know that EWR to SFO is the IATAN codes necessary, right? Now, though, when we book plane tickets, most of us don't use travel agents because we can go to a common language site like a Kayak, an Expedia, whatever, and I can say, take me from New Jersey to San Francisco. And on the back end, it's the technology that's making the translations into the IATAN codes and doing all of that used to have to be done by a physical person. That's the same thing we're doing here with wireless. Instead of asking you to define this, we're asking you to pick from a drop down saying, this is the scenario. It's going in a conference room. It's going in an auditorium. It's going in a classroom. And based on that, we're going to translate it into what technology settings we think are going to work best.
So some of the ergonomics that you're talking to are enhanced by the Bluetooth capabilities. So talk to us a little bit about that and the use of tracking and the ability to basically be at a camera site and you're standing there with your mobile device and you say, all right, what's on this camera right next to me? Rather than getting onto downloading the app, looking for the site, download the, and making 5 or 6 or 7 connections. You're looking at the camera there, you're standing there with your device and you say, I want to know what was seen here by this camera, in the last hour or two.
Yeah, so the Bluetooth use cases, this is one of those things where we are unlocking different applications. So this actually, I'll kind of combine these two ideas together, okay? So you talked earlier about analytics, right? And what these cameras can do from that sense. If you think about, I'll give you another analogy here, right? If you think about when the iPhone first came out, right? The iPhone was revolutionary because it was this platform and you could take really smart people that built the iPhone, but you didn't have to have the same really smart people building all the applications that went on the iPhone. Okay. So you had other people in the world out there figuring out, hey, with this technology, I can do XYZ with it. And that's what really revolutionized the iPhone, right? All right. So how do we tie that back to IT? With the camera system, right, we are building a platform that other people can plug into. We actually have a application marketplace available, okay? And there's companies out there going, hey, with these Meraki camera feeds plus other cloud solutions, I can tell you whether or not someone is wearing a mask, for example, right? That's a really popular one that's going on right now. And we have a technology partner that actually built that. Okay. Now, going back to your Bluetooth question, right? With that as part of this hardware platform, having this technology there, now I can have other companies that go, hey, I make a Bluetooth badge. Okay. So if I have an employee that is walking around with this Bluetooth badge and my camera, where I know where that is in the building, can tell me the proximity of that Bluetooth badge, I've now unlocked a whole other use case, right? I've unlocked now this company can build a software platform that says, I know exactly where Sal is in the building because we're triangulating him based on the Bluetooth radios from all the cameras, right? So that's really what this technology like BLE is all about. It's adding more functionality to the platform that unlocks other use cases that people can dream of.
And I think that's the important thing to take note of here is that these are not meant to be video surveillance cameras, but rather sensors on the network. And so think about it in terms of those use cases and how you can start building into safety initiatives, marketing initiatives, other areas of the business that may have a vested interest in getting access to vision.
Well, that's been the holy grail that integrators have been, looking for years because, back before the security equipment was leveraged for any other business cases, it was an expense only, and there was no way to be generating any kind of other operational revenue from it. So, to be able to have, 3 or 4 benefits, from a sensor deployment, with security being one of the collateral benefits, it certainly helps in the funding justification for the deployment of solutions that are both for safety, security, and for business operations.
Yeah, and this definitely resonates with us in IT because for the longest time, we were thought of as the ultimate cost center that did not return value to the organization. In the annual budget meetings, they would get to the IT line item and the CFO would just go, how much money are we throwing in the IT black hole this year? So this is a way in which we can actually attach a return on investment to some of these IT initiatives that we're doing today.
And I'll add one more piece to this is that this is not something that we're prophesizing that can happen. This is something that Meraki has been very successful at doing in the past with Wi-Fi. Okay, so we just talked about IT as a cost center, infrastructure as a cost center. We have a long track record, especially when it comes to retail environments, of saying, hey, marketing, wouldn't you like to know how many people walked by the front of this store or how many people came into this store? And we've taken that motion and said, hey, marketing, how about you give us some of that budget for the IT infrastructure and we can return that value to you, right? So when we say that we can do that same thing with cameras, we're not just like imagining that. This is a tried and true process that we've done with other parts of the technology stack. So
can you elaborate a little bit more on the types of system deployments that you have, maybe in the different types of verticals? You mentioned retail, do you have some, what about on infrastructure and
certainly.
Transportation and city surveillance and, healthcare, and where have the sweet spots been so far?
Certainly. So I think all of the above, where we've seen probably the most interesting use cases, in my opinion, some of them are in quick service, retail, and restaurants. So the idea is when COVID hit, it completely changed the way that we interact with people. It completely changed the way that we dine out, or in most cases, don't dine out anymore. And so to help facilitate some of this curbside dining, a lot of restaurants have started doing mobile ordering with curbside pickup. The question became, how can we be as efficient as possible in understanding when somebody arrives to pick up their order so that we can get them out of that parking space for somebody else? This is where we were able to leverage technology. So utilizing the camera as a sensor, we're able to leverage the vehicle detection capabilities. And so when a car pulls into that parking space, we're able to say, ding, 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 we see a car. Now, at the same time, we're able to leverage Bluetooth in our wireless access points to see which Bluetooth clients are in the area and to see if any of these Bluetooth clients are perhaps using our mobile ordering app. Within your mobile ordering app, you, of course, have a unique ID that ties back to your user. And so now I can not only say a car pulled up, but based on the app of the person who's sitting in the car, I can say that this is CJ Ramsey. I can see that he ordered 8 double cheeseburgers, and I will be out there right away to give him his food and get him out of here. So That's a cool real world example that I see in terms of how to, become more efficient in delivering services. The other one that always resonates very, very closely with me is in healthcare. During COVID, I think one of the most challenging things we saw was people who weren't able to see loved ones in the hospital, whether that be family members or, in the most heartbreaking cases, newborn babies. Imagine not being able, see your newborn because they're in the ICU or NICU rather, and it's incredibly locked down. This is where we can begin to leverage the power of technology in order to grant access through a patient's mobile app to actually get a live feed of their baby in the NICU. So these are things that are completely changing people's lives in terms of the quality during a very unnormal time.
So we talk about the ability to utilize the technology within different verticals. And as a result, I think it'd be worthwhile, maybe the last 2 minutes that we have is just a quick understanding of how do you segregate that information so that marketing doesn't get to see what security applications are. Security doesn't necessarily care to see what marketing might be interested in. How do you segregate that within your system?
Certainly. And again, we try to bring this idea of common language that people can understand. We leverage this idea of role-based access. And so we can say, this is the role that's granted to a security administrator versus this is the role that's granted to HR versus this is the role that's granted to facilities. Within that, we can correlate it with different cameras. And then there's multi levels of permission in terms of who can access footage, who can export footage, and who can actually make physical infrastructure changes. Although I think probably the most important thing we did recently, and Ryan's dying to talk about this, so I'll let him get into it more, is a brand new client-facing portal that's meant for people unlike me who don't want to know anything technical.
Yep. So what CJ's referring to there is we built the dashboard, right, for IT administrators, right? And then when we tried to add cameras into that, traditional camera folks were like, yeah, this is great. And I have to go log into this, and this doesn't have the views that I'm typically used to seeing, right? So we've learned a lot over the last 2 or 3 years since we've had the cameras, right? So one of the things that we are just now launching is called the Meraki Vision Portal. So if you are a camera administrator, you log in and you get a very specialized view of the Meraki dashboard that's been optimized for the use cases that you need, right? Being able to see cameras on a map, being able to click on a camera on a map, being able to watch a video wall, etc. So just a ton of very cool features and functionalities there. And this just lastly speaks to when you have a system like this, right, with that's cloud enabled, etc., that when you buy that system, that is the least amount of features that you're ever going to have, right? Like we are always going to be learning. We're going to be building new features, functionality into that. And these are things that just get enabled into your dashboard. So absolutely very exciting stuff that I think, like I said, we'll continue to learn from and continue to build out even more impactful products.
Oh, that's really good. And I appreciate Ryan and CJ, your time today. How would our listeners best, follow up to get more detailed information on the platform and the solutions?
Absolutely. You can check out our website. You can go to Meraki.com. That'll, redirect you to the Cisco webpage. It's Meraki. I know that's sometimes a little bit hard to understand when we say Meraki. But yes, Meraki.com. And what we'll leave you with is Meraki has this amazing program called the free trial program. So it is extremely easy for us to get brand new equipment into your hands so that you can actually set this up. We believe, seeing is believing. So, leverage that. There's actually a form on the website that you can fill out to request a free trial, and that is available to anyone.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. You have been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask that you subscribe to this show and like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We remind you that and ask if you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us. Please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.